Hi, I'm Nate Speare. I'm a practicing astrologer and researcher, and I'm here to give you a little bit of a forecast of the cosmic weather that we can experience in our physical lives and also our emotional lives over the course of this week. Basically, this week we're inclined to feel a lot of floods of passionate feeling, and it can take on a quality of not being very clear, of actually being kind of confusing, and there's this kind of hunger for clarity going on. And it's important for us to remember over the course of this week that confusion is a stepping stone to clarity. Confusion is a stepping stone to clarity. And we're inclined to feel this in a lot of different ways, both on political levels and in terms of our culture and what's going on with the election, and also personal levels in terms of our relationships to our loved ones. And the challenge that we have presented to us this week by the cosmos is really to stay with it, to stay with the feelings of confusion and with the ambiguous floods and the turmoil and fogginess of everything, instead of withdrawing into our fantasy world or into our ideas, because that's what we're very inclined to do when things get really rough and the tides get really strong and our vision gets all fogged up by everything. So especially this week, we're inclined to have these feelings of wanting to cover ourselves over with a veneer or with a perfume or with a story that we tell the world about ourselves that makes us feel like everything is going really well and like we're hot and all that kind of stuff. And the challenge we have presented to us is to actually feel our humanity and share our hearts instead of do everything with that veneer as the week goes on. So how did we get here? Well, Saturn, the lord of structure and the lord of karma, has been, getting into bed with Venus, the planet of beauty and relationships, over the end of the week and the weekend. And what that basically is a recipe for is the structures and boundaries in which our relationships can have space for our own freedom and genius are being called into question. So what are the structures and boundaries in which my relationships can live in such a way that my freedom can be alive and can be circulating and flowing? And this week there's a little bit of a twist to that, in that Chiron, who's the wounded healer, so brings up wounds and also brings up possibilities for healing those wounds, is making a challenging angle to Venus, again, Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty and relationship and art. A couple of weeks ago, if you recall the forecast, the wounded healer made a supporting angle to Venus. So wounds and relationships were kind of flowing together. There was a sense with our loved ones that conversations were being opened up, and there was the possibility that emotions could be aired and that it was okay and there was space and support for it. Well, this week there might be something similar, but it's actually a harder angle, so we may feel our original wounds a little bit more acutely, and there's a much stronger desire for clarity. We want to be clear about our boundaries. We want to be clear about what we want in our relationships. There's a strong hunger for clarity. And that also means, though, that there's a stronger potential for healing, and there's a stronger potential for articulating what our sense of woundedness actually is. And because Venus is in Sagittarius, which is a sign of diversity and of a sort of cross-cultural mindset, we can see this on personal levels, but also on political and social, widespread cultural levels. We can just look at what's been happening with Standing Rock, with the whole issues of Standing Rock, and this kind of seed of possibility for different cultures coming together, and the potential for healing, healing which has to do with addressing wounds that go way, way, way far back. So we're seeing the potential for healing on a deep spiritual level, but we're also seeing, like, even more in our faces, the wounds and the rawness of those wounds. So it's important to pay attention to this. Another thing that's happening is the sun, our conscious sense of who we are, is supporting Neptune, the planet and the god of spirituality and of compassion, and also of escape, of escapist tendencies. So when Neptune and the sun are kind of flowing together, Neptune sort of fogs up or floods or overwhelms what he touches. So that means if the sun is our conscious sense of who we are, our conscious sense of who we are this week is bound to be a little bit fogged up and even flooded at times. Now, that's the opposite, you might say, of a feeling of clarity. But it's actually, in disguise, another kind of clarity, because we're actually being asked to speak from our hearts, and which is a very difficult thing to do, actually. It has to do with not dividing the world into this and that. And it's a very, very high calling for us right now, especially with the presidential election coming up. We're even more likely to be dividing everything into us and them categories, into who's with us and who's against us. But the Sun and Neptune supporting each other are suggesting to us that the only way we're going to have any hope of healing anything is by listening to each other's stories and honoring each other's stories, even those who we consider to have views that are radically different from our own, and to have compassion for who we are, especially when little things go wrong. Because in terms of the sun, our conscious sense of who we are, we like everything to go right. We like everything to go our way. We might find this week that little minutiae kind of can go wrong, and the test is in how we react to that. Do we use those things to close down and shut away from our fellow humans, or do we use those things to open up and get curious and actually expose our naked, raw vulnerability of who we are? So I actually have, I invite you to practice, try a little experiment from now until next Sunday. And I'm not asking you to believe this, just to try it as an experiment, and then next Sunday sort of sit down and see what happened there, what happened when I tried that. So the experiment is, whenever somebody gets on your nerves, or if someone seems to be standing in your way this week, or even just strangers that you see on the street, practice saying to yourself, not out loud, but inside your head, practice saying to yourself, just like me, wants happiness, doesn't want suffering. Because that's the whole key this week, is sort of feeling our sense of collective humanity together. So whether it's someone who really pisses you off, or if it's just a stranger in the grocery store or, down the street, say to yourself on the inside, just like me, wants happiness, doesn't want suffering. And I'm not asking you to believe this, just try it out as a little experiment and see, on Sunday, report back to me, how did that go? Did anything shift there? And if so, what was it that shifted? So, because this is actually what all of this is getting at is, yes, our drivenness and our resolve, which the sun, the principle of the sun sort of represents that. What is our resolve? How do we rule our life? Our sense of ruling our life and our sense of organization can get really confused, and what confuses our resolve is our need for relational vulnerability, our need for each other, and our need to be human with each other, our need to be vulnerable with each other, and to be compassionate. And so sort of a little added contemplation this week is actually to see how close our need for relatedness is to our sense of revolutionary freedom and independence. To see how close those things actually are. Our vulnerability and our just raw need for each other, and our sense that we are radical geniuses, radical independent geniuses, driven to do great things. Contemplate how those things are actually closer together than we might have assumed in the past that they are. So speaking of revolutionary wildness and radicality, also talking to Venus is Uranus, the wild card and the liberator, who's making a supporting angle to Venus, the goddess of relatedness. Um, the this kind of reminds us of the myth of Uranus and the myth of actually of the birth of Venus. The challenge here is to not, again, withdraw into our revolutionary ideas, because that's what we can do when we're under the influence of wild, free radical Uranus. Uranus in the myth was impatient with human evolution. He did not want to see the fruit of his seed. So he kept on stuffing the population of the earth back into the womb of Gaia. He just wasn't, it didn't live up to the perfection that he had in his flash of brilliance in his mind. So Saturn his son Saturn ended up castrating him, which was in effect sort of castrating and sacrificing that impulse of revolutionary impatience. And what happened when Uranus was castrated? Out of Uranus's genitals, out of the sea foam mixed with Uranus's genitals, emerged Aphrodite, Venus. So if you actually think about that, out of the sacrifice of revolutionary impatience came the goddess and the principle of human relationship, of relatedness, of heart connections, of erotic connections. It's an interesting little paradox there. And if you think about it, the word sacrifice, if you think of the castration of Uranus as a sacrifice, the word sacrifice is linked with the word sacred. So actually, if we don't withdraw into our radical and independent ideas separate from the world, but we actually are able to relate with other people in an open-hearted and vulnerable way, even when it's scary and uncomfortable, we are actually transmuting our revolutionary impulses into something sacred. So chew on that for a little bit. In terms of the election and politics, we may see that both Trump and Hillary are going through tumultuous times in terms of their family lives, in fact, and we might see that Donald Trump puts forth a little bit of reactiveness to scandals surrounding his home and family life and his emotional life, and also potentially sex and money scandals surrounding him. But it's all very confused right now. But we might be seeing that coming forward. And with Hillary, she needs to show how much she cares on a heart level about what's happening, while also staying grounded and not being overwhelmed or not being turned into a zombie by the flood of all of this, Neptunian, as I said, fog that's coming her way. So to show how much she cares, but not being overwhelmed and deadened by all of that. And so as a sort of takeaway, I'll have a guided meditation later in the week that involves this practice of sharing our humanity together. But I would invite you to journal with these two questions. First is, what opens me up? And the second is, what shuts me down? How do I experience opening up to the world? And how do I experience shutting down and closing down to the world around me? And once again, I invite you to do that practice of every person you see, whenever you remember it, especially when someone gets on your nerves, say to yourself,